The topic that I've put together today is something that I've been personally grappling with. And this is also based on research that I've done in a multinational organization as part of my PhD. And I've adapted it for this audience, and so I really look forward to your feedback around the content. I'm hoping that we'll be advanced and we'll do some of the technology stuff, but part of this is a masterclass, and I'm hoping that there'll be interaction and engagement, and we'll have some conversations. A little bit about me. So I define as an organizational psychologist. That's what I'm most salient, most importantly. I'm an HR professional. I've worked in the industry for the last 25 years. And I work mainly as a specialist, as an organizational development specialist, learning and development specialist. I've worked in retail organizations, FMCG, mainly. I was the Director for Learning and Development and OD at EdCon. My last role was also the Head of Talent for the Coca-Cola Company, where I looked after Russia, Middle East, Turkey, and Africa, and I had a team across. So my context in terms of what I bring today is not only as a practitioner, but also as a leader of people. So in my role at EdCon, probably had about 100 people in the function. EdCon had about 30,000 people, which we did the training for. My role in the Coca-Cola Company, I had about 5 learning and developments or talent development specialists based in Russia, Istanbul, Dubai, and Kenya, Nairobi. And so I've worked with diverse teams across the region. I've worked with diverse teams within South Africa. And so this masterclass is not only as an HR practitioner, but as leaders in terms of how I want us to engage with this content. So I'm also a researcher, organizational researcher. We're competing for attention on this side. I hope you can hear me fine. Shall I talk louder? So I do this. Okay. So I'm also a scientist, organizational scientist, and I base the work that I do in the science of organizational behavior in organizational studies. And so I thought, as a way of introduction, that we'll use some of the science to find out what kind of people do we have in this room. So the research shows us that different personalities relate to different shapes. And the shape that you are drawn to indicates the kind of personalities that you have. And personality is just the characteristics of who you are, right? So I want you to look at these shapes. This is an introduction, so I know who I'm dealing with, and I can adjust, as part of my situational leadership style to the audience, right? So if you look at that triangle, if you look at that, you say, that's me. Just put up your hand.
What depends on what else?
Okay, well, okay. Well, I think you're a cynical group. Okay, I'll put all up and we'll go back again.
You want the most interesting? Oops.
That's come on. Oh, damn. This is a spoiler. Damn it.
Bias.
Okay, so choose one of those. Let me go back.
Yes.
Triangle. Yeah. Square.
Square.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do a circle.
Okay.
Yes.
So those are the forward-thinking people, problem solvers, people's people.
Okay. Wow.
Sorry, my slides. I threw it all away. I'm sorry. Do we have any Z people
yes.
here? All right. So this was just a icebreakers, no research. I made it up. You're not a Z. If you're a Z and this is all made up, it's got nothing. It's just an icebreaker.
Damn it! I thought I was.
So I'm part of an organization called Authentic Organizations. I've started this. I'm the founder and CEO of the organization. Essentially, what we do is consulting, we do coaching, and we do development. And the work that I do here is around particularly working with marginalized individuals and organizations, helping them to be their best selves. So that's the organization that I've created, and that's the work that I do. So the masterclass, I was curious about what is a masterclass. So it says a masterclass class is, this is a class that's given by an expert to highly talented students, right? So I thought, okay, well, let's turn that around, right? So I'm a colleague, and you are my fellow participant. So this is a class around authentic leadership in the workplace, and giving my insights to you as highly talented participants. So we know where the talented people came to, right? So that's what this is about. So this is interactive. We're going to workshop. I've got material here. We're going to work with this. And I want you to, my ask from you today for this hour that we have is to be present, to engage with the content, because as part of this is to provide you with some tools as to think about authentic leadership and how to evaluate yourself in terms of where you're at. So that's my ask, if that's okay. And I'll share my expertise because I've spent the last 8 years reading, thinking, doing research around this. So even if it's not related, ask the question because maybe someone else is thinking that question as well. So is that okay as a contract between us? So okay, so I'm hoping that we will identify how your followers replicate your authenticity at work. Now, how many of you have people reporting to you? Let's just have a sense. Okay, so you all are leaders, right? And so we have leaders of self, leaders of others, and leaders of leaders. And so we have different types of leaders. And so as you think about this, what I'm hoping that you get out of the session is to think about how do you impact your followers. And as you think about your own experience, think about other leaders, your colleagues, other executives in your organization or in your teams, and how are they affecting the kind of culture that you're creating in the organization. Understand how this authenticity impacts the outcome that it has on that may have on individuals. Learn how to be a fearless leader that can be authentic. So I'll give you specific steps based on research, what the dimensions are, and we'll do an exercise around that as well. And understand how you may be, and I should have put that, I deliberately took that word out, but may be complicit in the oppression of others in the workplace. And so we'll come to that point, and I'll share with you what some of the research shows and what some of my thinking is around that. Good? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we'll start off with what is authentic leadership. I'll give some definitions. I think it's important to start off with like a basic understanding that we're all working from the same premise in terms of how we define it. Once again, it's one lens, it's one slice, and there may be other definitions around this as well. Why does this matter? Why has this become important in organizational literature? How can I become an authentic leader in the workplace? And we'll have an assessment around afterwards. What are some of the key takeouts that you have, given the conversation that we've just had? And I see this as a conversation, right? So I want us to really have an interactive session around this. So let's set the context in which we operate. And I'm pleased with how many of the speakers set the context not within the South African environment only, because we're a global player, right? And so we operate in a global world, and a global world that's connected, that is volatile, that's uncertain, that's complex, that's ambiguous. And so the world is not going to become less simplistic or it's not going to get any better. It's just going to get far more complex as we enter into the world. And one of the things that I think is key to keeping us grounded in this complex world in which we operate is our identity. Who am I? So think about a ship with an anchor, and you have the storm raging above the water, and that anchor that keeps the ship still. That is your identity. That's how identity manifests in the workplace and in society. So that's what identity represents, and I believe the notion or the concept of identity will become increasingly important in the world of work. Now, in social science, within social psychology, a lot of work has been done around identity. More recently in organizational studies, we've done some more work around identity at work, and I'll give you some of those definitions in a moment. Make sense in terms of the context in which we're operating in? Also markets that are crazy. I mean, South Africa, in terms of our great growth rates, it's no different from what's happening in Brazil. Argentina is collapsing. I mean, so the world is crazy with the rise of nationalism. I mean, it's just a crazy world. And how do we make sense of this world in a way that helps those that we lead to also find their way in this chaos? So that's the context within which I'm presenting this content today to you. So what is authentic leadership? So I just thought I'd put this up in terms of so as we look in the mirror and we think about who am I? Can I be myself? And what is the consequences of that authenticity in the workplace? And that's essentially the research questions as part of my PhD that I asked a number of black professionals between the age of 24 and 34. Then I interviewed managers, black managers across the ages and ethnicities. And I also wrote my own autobiography, my own story as a black professional. How did I get to this point? Who am I? And so I'll share some of that data as part of this session as well. So, can you be yourself at work and why?
You want to start?
Yeah, sure. Can we just talk or?
Yeah.
Yes. You can just go.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think in an ideal, yes, you want to say that you can be yourself, but I'm becoming more and more cynical about whether organizations really allow you to be yourself.
Yeah.
Later, as I'm getting older, I think that organizations don't allow you to be yourself. You've got to get there, see what the organization's like, and modify yourself to fit the culture of or that's my experience.
So what does that mean in terms of who you show up as?
You show up as what the organization needs you to be.
So you put up a facade?
I think so.
Yeah?
That's just my opinion.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts? One other thought. Can you be yourself at work and why?
I think the space is not there for one to be truly oneself at work. Because also besides the policies and the norms and standards of the employer, you also have the culture of the organization. So a culture of the organization will definitely influence how you behave in that space.
Okay. So there's more comments at the back, yeah? Hi.
I think if you can't be yourself at work, you get the wrong place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's exhausting trying to be something different, especially if what you bring is special. So you end up going home every day and feeling as though you were because it was a job. It wasn't something that you were passionate about. So you would earn your living and you would do what you have to do, but you would slowly die inside.
Okay. Thanks for sharing. There's one other comment. I want us to move on because I want to share some of the thinking, right? So, but one other comment.
I would quickly say I agree with the first speaker. The reality is the environment in a workplace would drive you towards becoming something that you are not. Because every time you're trying to become yourself, you then get drawn into a situation that you need to also have in mind that you represent the company that has to be driving profits. So many of the time, there's a lot of things that you would do that if you look at yourself, if you were yourself and running your own business, you would not have made such a decision. So I really don't believe it's easy to do things as you would want them to.
Thanks for your comment. One more, then we're going to, two more, then we'll move on, right? One here and one here. And one there. Three, okay. I said interactive, right?
You got it.
I actually agree with someone who says if the environment doesn't allow you to be yourself, then you are at the wrong place. Because honestly, you'll find yourself saying things that you are amazed you have done and being ashamed of certain things.
So to keep yourself authentic, you just need to maybe give space to someone else.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
I wanted to say it depends on the leadership of that organization at that time. Because you might have a leader or kind of a leadership that would allow you to be yourself. And you might have a kind of a leadership that would not allow you to be yourself.
So it depends on leadership.
I'm going to get the third one.
Go ahead.
Everywhere I've worked, I've always been myself. Because I believe that everywhere I go, I need to influence the people that I come across. I become a leader. If the environment doesn't allow me and the culture is not according, is not aligned to my belief and my father, but I'm myself and I don't compromise who I am. And I'm not willing.
Well, thanks for sharing that. How many of you consciously think about who you are and think about who you want to become? How many of you, and show of hands? Okay, so it is something that we think about, right? There's a saying that if you don't have your own plan, you become part of someone else's plan, something to that effect, right? And so part of the work that I do around this is around consciousness, around our identity and the possibilities of who we can become, right? I'll share some of the results in terms of what I found in organizations and the consequences of the different prototypes of authenticity that you find in the workplace and based on the literature as well, because there's a lot of research around this work. So there's no right and wrong. So each of you, we're all unique, and so each of your responses are correct for you, right? And we'll touch on some of it. I think it's important to touch on a couple of things. What does self mean? What does self at work mean? I mean, I think we often talk about self broadly, but self is actually quite a complex psychological concept. And self is really just a vast domain of identity is a vast domain of self. So you have self and then you have identities that inform that, right? And so self is kind of the overarching concept. And so I think often we use those interchangeably and incorrectly. So identity is really the self-referential description that provides contextual appropriate answers to who am I and who are we. So what's my personal identity and what's my social identity? So that's really what identity is within the context of what we speak about. But I also think let's talk about what's work identity. Work identity is the self-concept. The self-concept is the structure with which you put the identity together that affects the roles and people, that affects the roles people adopt and the way we behave in organizations. So who am I? Who are we as an organization? And as a consequence, how do I behave because of how I define myself and my sense of belonging? I add another element to this, which is our role identity, and I'll talk in a moment about what that is. So what is authenticity at work? So authenticity at work is that alignment between how I feel inside and the ability to self-express that feeling without repercussions, the fear of the repercussions associated with it. So that takes courage. It takes you being fearless as an individual to be able to self-express. But let's not mistake authenticity with narcissism, because authenticity is about me, how I interact with others, and it's about building relationships. It's not about breaking relationships. So if someone's a narcissist and they're authentic, don't think that that's authenticity, right? But that is the dark side of authenticity, and there's a whole bunch of literature around that. But this is a positive psychology approach, saying let's look at that alignment between the positive inside and the positive expression to build relationship with others. Does that definition make sense? I want us to be clear, because as we move into more difficult work, we need to understand those basic concepts. Any questions about those?
See, when you were explaining that what's on the board, you added by saying without fear of repercussions. So you see, it just executed that at work, like I was saying earlier on, You cannot, there's no space for you to be freely who you are because there are nonsense standards set for your behavior by the employer. So if you behave or work outside those nonsense standards set by your employer, then there will be repercussions. You are correct to say authenticity at work is the alignment between individuals' internal experiences and friendship within a work context without any fear of repercussions. That is not there on the board.
Yep.
But that is very
important
critical
part.
and the important part.
So you need to have psychological safety to be able to be.
Yes.
We'll unpack this in terms of dimensions. It's a very important point. So I want to just get the definitions out of the way. So authentic leader, and this is part of my work that I've done, is the pattern of the leader behavior that fosters greater self-regard. So how do I evaluate my self-worth? And how do I evaluate how others sees me based on our biases that we've just heard from, right? So what is that self-regard? What is my agility to respond to my environment? How flexible am I if I enter into the environment and I experience these unsafe conditions? And what is my ability to respond to what I experience within my context? It is also about balance, and it's about boundarylessness by working with followers and fostering positive self-development. So this is a definition that I've created based on the research. There are other definitions around this as well. But I think the important elements here is about the dimensions that make up authentic leadership is about regard, it's about agility, it's about balance, and it's about boundarylessness. And so I'll work through all of these in a moment and share what the research shows around that. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, why does this matter? So are you ready to start working?
Yeah.
Okay, let me take my jacket off. So I'll just share some science. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but just so that you understand why this matters. So there's a lot of research that's emerging, and this is work by Van der Bosch and Towers, the Dutch researchers, that found strong correlations between authenticity at work and well-being and performance outcomes such as job satisfaction, intention to stay. So there are strong correlations, and this is just one of the studies, but there's a whole body of knowledge that's emerging around finding strong correlations between authenticity at work and positive outcomes and well-being. So what does that mean then? So if I'm not authentic, how does that affect my well-being, and how does that affect my work outcomes? So maybe yes, I'm performing, but am I at my best? And so that's really the question as we look at the science around why this is important. There's some more research that's been done. Some of this is South Africa. Standard did some work, which is a local research around authentic leadership and optimism and trust, employee engagement, and team performance. And so when a leader is authentic at work, it positively predicts trust, optimism, employee engagement, and team performance. And there's more research that talks about if your leader is authentic, that trickles down to the team leader and that trickles down to the individual eventually in terms of the outcomes that authenticity has on that organization or department or function as well. So there's clear science that shows us that this can be a good thing if we're able to be authentic, given the definitions that we've given now, right? So by consequence, it means it can be a bad thing if we put up facades. Because what does that do? When we put up a facade, we have to pretend. Fake it, I've heard it many times, fake it until you make it. I mean, some of my participants that I interviewed said, you know, it's like two jobs, the one guy said to me. He's 34-year-old. He said to me, it's like two jobs. My one job is my day job, and my second job is fitting in. It's taxing, it's tiring. I'm exhausted when I get home. Right? So there's science here that shows that this has a positive effect on our well-being and our work performance. So let's talk about how do we become authentic leaders. And so this, as I said, is based on a case study. I based the dimensions that I developed. It's a US-based company. It's been in existence over 100 years. It was first based in South Africa, in 1920s, it came to South Africa. My participants consisted of 15 young black professionals, black African professionals, and 11 black managers. These are colored Indian and black African managers. And then my autoethnography. Autoethnography is really me telling my own story and doing a critical analysis of my own story, which is the most difficult thing that I've ever done. But I'll share some of that in between. And then I interviewed the HR director to understand how the organization then is approaching it. Now, I'm not going to give you all of this research, but I've woven it into the discussion so that we can try and use it, have this conversation based on science. So just a kind of a definition. So the definition that I created around this is authentic work identity is defined as the alignment between my personal role and social identities with a broader context and my ability to self-express within that context. Now let me break this down. So my personal identity is my sense of uniqueness. So for me, I went to university in the 80s, 90s, late 80s, and I went to UWC, and just the last kind of bits of the Defiance campaign, and that defiance is part of who I am. I'm defiant. My values are based on fairness and equity, and if I experience that in an environment that's like a red rag, I become like, what's that, bull in a china shop? Is that the word? Right? And so my values are core to who I am as an individual, and it's driven based on my upbringing in terms of my fairness and equity. So that talks about my uniqueness. I'm certain length, certain eyes, none of you look the same, right? So that's your personal identity. Your social identity is your sense of inclusion. And so what that means is the social categories and groups to which you belong. So for example, one of the groups that I belong to, I'm a gay man. So I identify as a gay man in my personal and social life. That's who I am as a man. I'm also identified as a colored man. I have lots of issues with that classification, and that's another talk for another day. I also identify, so my ethnic identity is that of colored. My racial identity is that of black. And I think we often conflate these two because they're two different things, right? So, in terms of my role, I identify as a psychologist, organizational developer in the organization. I'm also an organizational researcher. So how we define authenticity within the context is how do I configure these elements to make up who I am in the workplace? So how do I take my sense of uniqueness with my sense of belonging to social categories to my role expectation? How do I balance those elements? And then how do I then show up and engage with you based on how I've configured myself? Does that make sense? Right? And so that's how I've conceptualized this. Of course, this is one perspective. It's both based on social psychology theory and identity theory, which is in sociology. So that's kind of the basis of this definition. And so I want us to work with this now as we think about who you are as an individual. So based on my research, I found 3 prototypes. And some of you were already talking about those prototypes, and I was like, I had to keep back not to say anything. So our followers replicate this. And so what I'm proposing here is what I saw in the individuals was based on the experiences of the managers that I interviewed as well. There was a correlation between those two. And so who I am is how my followers will respond to me as well. Okay? So let's look at these kind of prototypes. So the one prototype is an authentic work identity. Remember we talked about authenticity and work identity. So in terms of the participants, 31% of the PMs, people managers, okay, PMs, said, I'm authentic and I can be myself here. It's like some of you said, right?
Sure.
20% of the young YVPs, young black professionals, said they could be authentic. So just look at this one. People manager said, I think I am myself here at work because I don't have to prove I don't have to prove anything to anyone. So that's a typical kind of a quote. Another quote from a young black professionals is that I don't compromise myself. And if I have to compromise myself, I will leave. Similar to what you've been saying, right? So that's authenticity. And what these individuals do, if you look at those bubbles, as I explained it a moment ago, they're able to get a dynamic balance between who they are in terms of their sense of uniqueness, their sense of belonging, and their role expectations. If you remember the definition earlier, in terms of those bubbles, right? So these individuals were able to find a dynamic balance between these elements that make up who they are in terms of their identity. Then there was a second group of people that I termed limited authenticity. And so, once again, 38% of the people managers said that I can be myself to some extent, right? And 60%, majority of the young black professionals. So, an example, there's some parts of me that I bring to work and some parts that I don't. But what happened here is that these individuals, they over-identify with the organization to the extent where they lose their sense of self. Now, this company I work with in terms of this study had a very strong organizational identity. And it overpowered, if you ask the person what they do, they say, I work for this organization. I just need to, I almost said it now. I need to watch myself. So they would say, I work for this organization. If you ask someone else, what do you do? They'll say, I'm an accountant. So the identification is with the role as opposed to social identification, right? And so they said, I mean, some of the things that we said, I work there 5 years, it runs in our blood. You know, that's kind of masculine stuff we do with these organizational identities. And so their social identity was there's an over-identification with the social identity, with the organizational identity, at the expense of my uniqueness and my sense of belonging. Make sense?
Yeah.
Then the last prototype is those people that said, some of you, I just can't be myself here. Put up a facade, and these are people that 15% and 20% of the young, 15% of the people managers, and 20% of the young black professionals. And what these individuals did is they compartmentalized who they are. So who I am at work is a different person from who I am at home. So when I come into this gate, I put up my costume, and I do my job, and I take my costume out as I leave the organization. And that's one way of coping, right? And those were the 3 categories that then emerged from the study. So, leaders' expectation of individuals to merely comply to organizational identity and values without due consideration of who those individuals are and their own personal values affected these individuals in terms of their what's called a contingent low self-esteem. So it's the contingent on my manager saying I'm doing well. Unproductive personal energy. Just think about it. I'm spending so much time fitting in that I don't focus on work. It's all about the politics. It's all about trying to fit in. It's exhausting, it's taxing, and it's unproductive use of my energy and time. Mistrustful climate that we create because it's not psychologically safe. So I don't trust my manager because it's not safe to be me. I don't. One of my participants said, I don't trust them with me. I just don't trust them. And of course, what happens, people then, the intention to leave is quite high. So as you think about your teams that you work in, to what extent do you see some of these outcomes and the productivity, the self-esteem of these teams, and how you could potentially affect that in terms of the people that you work with, your followers? Makes sense so far? Questions?
No, so, but I think you've covered in this explanation. On this slide, what I want to ask about slide number 23 was about, of the 3 categories, which one would be a high performer? In slide 24, you have covered that.
Yeah. So you can almost put this the flip side of this, and I'll talk a bit about the consequences of being authentic at work and what were some of those consequences, right? I'll talk about that in a moment. All right. So what I want you to do, I don't know whether I put enough. I've got some. So what I want you to do in terms of it, please indicate the degree to which you are able to be an authentic leader at work. So my daily leadership behavior at work reflects the real me. So I want you to write down question 1 and you need to write your response because we'll add it up later. We'll kind of put your configuration together of who you are in the workplace. So 1 is never, 2 is sometimes, 3 is always. So you write down question 1 and your score because we'll add it up later and we'll do a whole we'll conclude that later. So, okay? We're clear with that?
Yeah.
Everyone done it?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So that just talks about the configuration of how I put myself together. Where I want to go now is the dimensions that make this up. And let me tell you how I got this information. So I looked at all the limited authentic individuals. I looked at all the inauthentic individuals, and I looked at all the authentic individuals. And I looked at what are the common things that I'm picking up across these 3 elements. And I must preface this that, remember, this is a qualitative study. It's done in one organization. And so it may not necessarily be transferable to everyone, but it's transferable in terms of the knowledge that we created around this. And so I think that's important to make that decision. So, give that explanation. So what I then did is say, let's look at those elements of what is consistent across these individuals and how do they show up. And I'm going to take you through that in a moment. So what I found was, and I made up this acronym, is that authentic leaders are fab at work. So they're fabulous at work, right? And what that means is that they have a favorable regard of themselves and how they're seen by others. They are agile in terms of how they respond to their environment. They are balanced in terms of how they structure themselves. And they are boundaryless in how they think about their careers. So those are the 4 dimensions that then emerge, that was consistent across the 3 data sets that I then evaluated or analyzed. So what I'd like to do is take you through all of these 3 and just talk a bit about what that is, and then we'll do another rating of yourself as we establish your authenticity at work. Make sense? Yeah? Okay. So as we think about our own value, what makes you feel positive at work? Just think about that. What makes you positive at work?
I think it's the understanding of what the institution I work for is all about.
Okay.
We embracing that vision and saying,
And that's at an organizational level. Let's talk about team level and individual level. What makes you feel positive at those other aspects or those other levels as well?
Connectedness.
Connectedness.
Connected to people who share the same vision.
Okay.
Mine is feeling like I'm a blessing to someone. Maybe empowering someone on a daily basis. That's what makes
So a blessing.
feeling like you are a blessing to someone else.
Okay. Feeling that you're
Ensuring that you empower others
Yeah.
with what you do.
great. Thank you.
For me, the soft part of it, making a difference, and getting that feeling that I make a difference with someone else's life.
So it comes from inside. It's feeling good about myself, and that then makes me feel that I have a positive value, right?
Well, similar to what you said, however, what makes me feel getting things done and knowing that the work that I do carries impact. Because I actually believe that for me, every employee, when you go to work, you're not just going to do just to get by. You just there to make someone else's life better, one way or the other. Because it's
So this is all about evaluation, right? So how do I evaluate myself and how do others evaluate me determines how valuable I perceive myself in the workplace. Does that make sense, right?
Yeah.
So let me share what we found in the research. So authentic black professionals were positive. Now, this is the data only looking at that one group of individuals that were authentic to say, what is in the data there? Why do these people feel positive about themselves? They set themselves, these individuals set themselves apart by emphasizing their education and their proficiency in English. Let me explain this. Remember, many of these are young black professionals that went to school after 94 or were at high school after 94, which meant that they probably went to the Model C schools. And remember, this organization employs the best talent in the market. I mean, if you didn't go to a certain school, they probably won't employ you. I'm exaggerating, but this is the top of the crop that they've employed, right? And so these individuals had to survive in these environments where they were a minority. And one way is, one participant said to me, I was only taught in my vernacular when I was up to 5, and then I end up at the school and I can't speak English. And mastering English was my way of coping in the environment to get self-evaluation. And so often what we talk about, we use this very lightly, we talk about coconuts, we have derogative names, but these were coping mechanisms. And the English proficiency was a way of setting them apart from others that sound like me. My accent that I have a very Eastern Cape accent, and that's how I talk, right? But they have a twang.
Yeah.
And that's the way in which these individuals set themselves apart. And so they created this positive sense of who they were as individuals that are not like the other black professionals, right? But that's the way of, and it's not about a judgment about, it's an evaluation of how these individuals made sense of their environment. I look at you, look very puzzled here.
No.
You're just interested.
I'm just amazed.
Yeah.
Inspired.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So what these individuals also did well is they integrated their racial, ethnic, and also their gender identities into the workplace. So the one participant was a female participant, and she was the only person that was authentic and was able to integrate her gender identity into the workplace in a way that she felt comfortable about herself. And I'll show you some of the coping mechanisms that she used. So it was more about racial identity and ethnic identity, and there was only one gender, or I suppose people managers, there were a couple of them as well, in terms of their gender identity. So able to be proud to be a female in the workplace and not assume masculine attributes to try and fit into the workplace, right? So these, and also similar, be proud of being your ethnic identity, racial identity, without pretending to be something else. So they were able to integrate this into the way they did things. They had developed distinctive attributes, including courage to defy stereotypes about themselves. They were collaborative, they were connected. So they had distinctive virtuous attributes that set them apart from others. And you'll see later, people managers were jealous of this. Because they're like, we don't understand this group of people. These are black people managers, right? And we'll talk a bit about that. They, as a consequence of this kind of self-worth that they've created, they had a high self-esteem. But sometimes this was contingent. Contingent on my manager saying, hey, you're doing well. So high self-esteem is great, but if it's contingent, then it means that you fluctuate between high and low, depending on the kind of feedback you get. And so you want a more stable self-esteem. This YBP 3, Young Black Professional 3 said, these managers tend to battle with my confidence because they feel challenged. And so this is a younger generation of people saying, these older black people they don't understand me. They don't know where I come from. And so this talks to how these individuals were creating a positive sense of who they were in the workplace. Thoughts, comments on that? Sure.
Let's say influence dimension. Just by looking, we can try to make sense of the 5 that are there. does not seem to gel, hanging well with the rest. And I'm trying to imagine what that makes in real terms. So they say, what we say, they're emphasizing their education and proficiency in English. Was this a deliberate act? Is it something that just happened to be what defines them? What do we mean emphasizing? Does it mean exaggerating, taunting?
So it's about identification, right? So they identified with a group of black professionals that were positive. They were highly educated, that spoke differently than the person from the township. And that's the kind of identification they had. And so that positive evaluation gave them a positive self-esteem in the workplace. So it's how they evaluated themselves and how they made sense of the stigma that others may have of them, and elevated themselves and transcended that stigma by creating this positive sense of who they are, by speaking well, by being well educated. And so those are the things that created, which sets them apart from others. And so that's really what this talks about. So there's a comment there and I'll come back here.
I'm not really sure if you can say that if I'm reading that, I'm not really sure if I can attribute that talks to authenticity. Because, I mean, you will find people that let's say we set them apart by emphasizing their education and proficiency. But that's really who they are. Because sometimes you put this front because you are running away from something. And then I would get to see this side because I not necessarily honestly believe, but sometimes the society puts us in that, in that direction. Or sometimes I was forced to behave a certain way because I feel that it will make me more acceptable to a certain group of individuals that are my interests. And also I think with age, obviously that actually talks to me now. For me, as I age, you get comfortable in your own space. For example, for me, I appreciate the person that acknowledges me. When I say I'm from KZN, obviously so many comments will come up. But at the same time, because now I'm comfortable, it doesn't matter what you say, because I know who I am. But then when you start coming with those things, the question is, do you honestly know who you are? So for me, I'm not really sure that actually you find authenticity when you just, by speaking.
If I can contextualize, remember we're only talking about the ones part, right? Which is the one dimension, favorability, which is around evaluation of myself. And I'm just sharing what I found and how these individuals that had said I'm authentic and what the triangulation of the data and so this is the characteristics of these individuals, right? So it's an evaluation of self and how they transcend how others think of them, how that they make sense of the societal stigma that they've experienced. We're going to have to move on, otherwise we're not going to get through, right? I want to just, one more comment and then we'll move on, right? Yeah.
Sorry. Can I ask?
So I've just, can I just give the gentleman an opportunity, if you don't mind?
What I just want to say is they can put their comments on Slido, please.
Okay.
There's almost 40 people in the room. Only 3 people has voted and there's only 1 comment on there. Remember, this information is very important for IPM, very important feedback for Dr. Cook. So, and IPM uses that. So if you're struggling to get into Slido, call me over, I'll come on to you. But the rest that's in, please put your comments on and then you can field it afterwards. Otherwise, we're not going to get done. If you don't mind.
Do you mind if you can pre-empt questions on CS2? On
CS2?
Yeah.
Yes, I will do that now.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I thought you wanted to comment.
No.
So remember, we're dealing with favorability, meaning how do I evaluate myself and how others evaluate, and the consequences of that on how we evaluate ourselves. So I want you to evaluate yourself now. So as an authentic leader, I support people to overcome stigma at work. So 1, so this is question 2, so question 2, and then 1, never, 2, sometimes, 3, always. Okay? Have you all done that? Okay. So we talked about evaluation of self and how others evaluate and how do we deal with the stigma that we experience in the workplace and society and how people make sense out of that, right? So let's look at the next one, which is balance. So how agile are we at work? Okay, so what we found in the data when I did the evaluation around these individuals is that those people that identified as authentic and said, I'm authentic, so let me tell you what I did. So I looked at the data, I did an analysis of everyone, and I categorized them according to the 3 categories that I created. Then I got 3 independent doctoral doctorates who are South African and working experience in the field of identity. I sent them all the transcripts, and they evaluated these people again. And based on the summary of that, they come up with these categories, right? So it's not something that I only did on my own. And then based on that, I then developed these dimensions. So just talk about the rigor of getting to that data. So what I found that those that were authentic at work were agile when they were able to deal with identity threats. So the kind of social stigma, what we experience in our environment, through integration and through balanced identity tactics. Let me explain that. So integration is when you integrate yourself into the organization to try and fit into the organization. So we all need to fit in. You can't come to an organization and be an individual. It's not going to work, right? So, but there's an extent to which we fit into an environment. But they were also able to balance the different parts of who they are to the extent that kept them grounded. I heard a speaker talk about being grounded. So it's integrating but remaining grounded. And I'll share some of the tactics that these individuals use to stay grounded. They integrated the values of the organization as if it was their own. And there's a difference between integrate and to the extent where it's their own as opposed to what is called a facade of conformity. So what that means is that they pretend to integrate those values, but actually they don't. These individuals were able to integrate the organizational values as if it was their own.
Which one would be a high performer? In slide 24, you have covered that.
Yeah. So you can almost put this, the flip side of this, and I'll talk a bit about the consequences of being authentic at work and what were some of those consequences, right? I'll talk about that in a moment. All right. So what I want you to do, I don't know whether I put enough, I've got some. So what I want you to do in terms of it, please indicate the degree to which you are able to be an authentic leader at work. So my daily leadership behavior at work reflects the real me. So I want you to write down question 1 and you need to write your response because we'll add it up later. We'll kind of put your configuration together of who you are in the workplace. So 1 is never, 2 is sometimes, 3 is always. So you write down question 1 and your score because we'll add it up later and we'll do a whole we'll conclude that later. So, okay? We're clear with that?
Yeah.
Everyone done it?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So that just talks about the configuration of how I put myself together. Where I want to go now is the dimensions that make this up. And let me tell you how I got this information. So I looked at all the limited authentic individuals. I looked at all the inauthentic individuals, and I looked at all the authentic individuals. And I looked at what are the common things that I'm picking up across these 3 elements. And I must preface this that, remember, this is a qualitative study. It's done in one organization. And so it may not necessarily be transferable to everyone, but it's transferable in terms of the knowledge that we created around this. And so I think that's important to make that decision. So, give that explanation. So what I then did is say, let's look at those elements of what is consistent across these individuals and how do they show up. And I'm going to take you through that in a moment. So what I found was, and I made up this acronym, is that authentic leaders are fab at work. So they're fabulous at work, right? And what that means is that they have a favorable regard of themselves and how they're seen by others. They are agile in terms of how they respond to their environment. They are balanced in terms of how they structure themselves. And they are boundaryless in how they think about their careers. So those are the 4 dimensions that then emerge, that was consistent across the 3 data sets that I then evaluated or analyzed. So what I'd like to do is take you through all of these 3 and just talk a bit about what that is, and then we'll do another rating of yourself as we establish your authenticity at work. Make sense? Mm. Yeah? Okay. So as we think about our own value, what makes you feel positive at work? Just think about that. What makes you positive at work?
I think it's the understanding of what the institution I work for is all about.
Okay.
We embracing that vision and saying
And that's at an organizational level. Let's talk about team level and individual level. What makes you feel positive at those other aspects or those other levels as well?
Connectedness.
Connectedness?
Connected to people who share the same vision.
Okay.
Mine is feeling like I'm a blessing to someone, maybe empowering someone on a daily basis. That's what makes.
So a blessing.
Feeling like you are a blessing to someone else.
Okay. Feeling that you
ensuring that you empower others with what you have.
Great. Thank you.
For me, the soft part of it, making a difference, that giving that feeling that I make a difference with someone's life.
So it comes from inside. It's feeling good about myself, and that then makes me feel that I have a positive value, right?
Well, similar to what you said, however, what makes me feel getting things done and knowing that the work that I do carries respect. Because I actually believe that for me, every employee, when you go to work, you're not just going to do just to get by.
So we talked about evaluation of self and how others evaluate, and how do we deal with the stigma that we experience in the workplace and society, and how people make sense out of that, right? So let's look at the next one, which is balance. So how agile are we at work? Okay. So what we found in the data when I did the evaluation around these individuals is that those people that identified as authentic and said, I'm authentic, so let me tell you what I did. So I looked at the data, I did an analysis of everyone, and I categorized them according to the 3 categories that I created. Then I got 3 independent doctoral doctorates who are South African and working experience in the field of identity. I sent them all the transcripts, and they evaluated these people again. And based on the summary of that, they come up with these categories, right? So it's not something that I only did on my own. And then based on that, I then developed these dimensions. So just talk about the rigor of getting to that data. So what I found that those that were authentic at work were agile when they were able to deal with identity threats. So the kind of social stigma, what we experience in our environment, through integration and through balanced identity tactics. Let me explain that. So integration is when you integrate yourself into the organization to try and fit into the organization. So we all need to fit in. You can't come to an organization and be an individual. It's not going to work, right? But there's an extent to which we fit into an environment. But they were also able to balance the different parts of who they are to the extent that kept them grounded. I heard a speaker talk about being grounded. So it's integrating but remaining grounded. And I'll share some of the tactics that these individuals use to stay grounded. They integrated the values of the organization as if it was their own. And there's a difference between integrate and to the extent where it's their own, as opposed to what is called a facade of conformity. So what that means is that they pretend to integrate those values, but actually they don't. These individuals were able to integrate the organizational values as if it was their own. And some of their environments were not psychologically safe. The lady sat on this side. Said, I'll leave if I'm not myself. Some of my participants said, these are, I'm talking engineers, I'm talking about top marketeers, really, very talented people. Black professionals said, if you don't accept who I am, then I leave. So if you look at the YBP 11, he said, maybe the company doesn't really want me. Maybe they want me to be a certain kind of person. And if that's what they want, I'll leave. That's what that individual said. Right? So I talked about the dependency, I talked about this kind of balance, complementary. So who we are doesn't have to be at odds of each other. It needs to be complementary. So my personal identity needs to be complementary with my social identity. It needs to be complementary with my role identity. So how do I balance those elements? And how does that allow me to show up? How do you show up? Like you show up today, right? This is showing up. How do you engage? How do you connect? As you think about the people that you work with in your organization. And the psychological safety that we create. What is psychological safety? Psychological safety is where people feel that they can be themselves. They can create themselves. There's conditions, the environment is being created so that they can show up and engage and connect with you. And you are the people that create that psychological safety in the organization as leaders. Right? And so that's an important part. And if it's not there, it's a lot harder. And I think you've made the comment earlier. Okay? So this talks about the balance that we create. This, once again, we spoke about the evaluation, my response in terms of my agility, and how do I put my structure together. And so this is the second last one. I create safe conditions for people to be authentic at work. 1, never. 2, sometimes. 3, always. So you put question number 4 and your score. We'll add up these scores in a moment. So the last one was really about career orientation or work orientation. So work orientation is a concept that consists of 3 elements. So how do you think about work? So 1, you can think work as a way of getting bored. Right? That's one way you should think about it, right? Second, you can think about work as a career. Or it could be a calling. Priest often sees what they do as a calling, right? So what their work orientation, this whole cohort that I had interviewed, their orientation was around career, which makes sense, right? They're professionals, so it's career orientation. But the notion of career orientation is very different. Those that were authentic said to me, and I'll give you examples of that. They said, YBP5, she worked in marketing. She said, I'm an artist selling dreams to improve communities' lives. This is a marketeer. This is how she describes her job. This person, by the way, now works in Ivory Coast. I mean, this is just how she thinks about her career. The flip side of this were people who said, oh, I want to become a marketing director. Oh, I want to become the HR director. These people thought across their jobs, across their function, across their departments, across the organization, across the continent. So boundaryless thinking in how they think about their work and in this case their career. YP3 said, I'm a strategist in the channels and commercial space. Not a commercial manager, but I'm a strategist. It's like my own business that I've created here. And so there's a difference between the person that wants to have this traditional hierarchical career than these individuals. And so the consequence for them is they had moved faster than others as well. So if I compared them to the career advancement of others, where those that were inauthentic and limited authenticity said, I'm thinking of leaving, I haven't moved as fast. Those that were authentic saying, I think I've done well. And it's the way they think about the work that they do. Make sense? So 4 elements that makes up how we can define our authentic leadership. Our favorability, how we evaluate ourselves, how we adapt to the environment, how we structure ourselves, and how we think about our careers. Make sense? So those are the dimensions as you think, as you configure who you are as an individual and how you want to show up and engage in the workplace. Okay, so these were just some of the comments from the managers. I mean, we've heard these comments before. Managers said, you know, these young people, they're entitled, they lack exposure, they're unrealistic in terms of their expectations. And one of the senior people was saying, you know, if I compare these young people to people in Burundi and Rwanda, they don't compare. And so my question then is this, you know, in terms of the expectation that we then have on these young people, when they think so boundaryless, you know, we expect them to come in and conform, but they think beyond the boundaries. And so how do we limit the progress and their attitudes and their perspectives of life when our experience have been so different? And hence the question I then ask, to what extent are we complicit in the oppression of these young people? And I'll talk about that in a moment, but let me not get ahead of myself. So the last one is, I enable people to achieve their full potential. So 5, 1, 2, or 3. Add up your scores. So add up all your scores. Then you take your score and you divide it by 15. Okay. So what percentage did you get? You got a percentage, right?
Right.
So that's a percentage. Did you all get a percentage? So when you divide it and then multiply by 100. So divide by 15, multiply by 100. So that's a percentage. Did you all figure that?
Yep.
Everyone? Okay. Look, this is just what I use for my study. It's not, yeah, so don't get too. So okay, so if you scored below 50, you most likely are an inauthentic leader at work. If you scored between 51 and 75, you have limited authenticity. If you scored between above 76, you're likely to be an authentic leader, right? So what I want you to do now is think about your personal identity, your social identity, and you think about your role identity, your leadership role identity. How does your configuration look like? Remember those 3 configurations that I showed you earlier? Draw your configuration of who you are as a leader. What does that look like for you?
You have to remind me of
The other one. But the point is, draw it the way that you... It's up, because how we configure ourselves is so different to everyone else. The important thing to consider, think about your sense of uniqueness, my personal identity. Think about my social identity, and think about my leadership identity. And how do I put, where does leadership sit? Where does my personal identity sit? Where does my social identity sit? And how do I configure? Just think about the people and how the followers are experiencing you at the moment. Anyone care to share how they configured and what does that mean? Does it mean anything for them? Who's going to be vulnerable?
Well, I've got something. I just realized how fortunate I am, because when I was quite young, I realized that I could not be fully myself, and I created an organization, my own organization, and how fortunate I am to be able to score really highly in this, because I am so fully able, and then how that also mirrors into the people that I work with, and it really is a gift.
Thanks for sharing. Anyone else? One more person? Just, even if it doesn't make sense, then that's also okay to share.
So the thing with me was the real, as you were going through it, was that I have had phases in my career where I've been completely authentic, and when I reflect on it as you're talking, it often depended on the organization I was in, the leadership, the culture, the whatever. And what I was talking about was a reflection of where I find myself today. So I guess the authenticity can shift. So I was capable of being authentic, but I am currently not. And when you ask me to draw the 3 circles, I draw the personal and the social authenticity pretty much overlapping. And the leadership role, I kind of saw as a little bit out. And that had to do not with what I do with my own people, but with what I'm allowed, in inverted commas, to do as a member of the executive of the organization, where the culture or the norms and values, whatever you want to call them, I'm feeling restricted by, and I'm afraid to do it.
Very important point. This is not a constant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is, depending on what's happening in your environment, you will adjust where you're at.
Yeah.
But it's the self-awareness to know where you're at,
Yeah.
to say, what do I need to do
Yes.
to create different balance or configuration between the elements that make up who I am, right?
And approximate authenticity, because I know that I can't do it fully at the moment.
And there's no right and wrong with this, right? There is no right and wrong. It's about the self-awareness, the consciousness. Because what happens is autopilot, right? We go through life autopilot. We don't think about who we are and how we show up. And so this is really helping you to create some consciousness about who you are and how you show up. One more point that we need to move on.
Well, maybe you can just put me together because I think I'm just getting it. But then the gentleman there was talking. I just actually looked at the leadership and then clubbed it with work. It's very funny because when I'm at work, I'm there, I'm 100%. I know that I would actually say I'm really, or I try to be authentic. But then, when now I'm putting, let's say now my personal life, my home life, but that's when everything shifts for me. It's it's guided by many things, and also tradition, culture, all of the things. Being a wife, now there are many things now that I'm taking away from that leadership role that I have at work. For me, though, I'm not talking about anyone else. Because there are things now that I just have to work around. All that. So there is a shift.
So all this is really about consciousness, right? So you need to think, what work do I need to do to create that kind of balance that I require in my life? So that I feel good about myself, I'm flexible, I'm agile, I'm balanced, and I'm boundless in the way I'm thinking about it. That's really, and it provides you a structure of thinking about it. But here's the point about oppression that I make. So this is just how you can think about it. So regard, what I found in the study, that those with inauthentic had a stigmatized regard, as opposed to a positive. Those that were, their agility, inauthentic individuals were very inflexible. So it's about how do I create more flexibility to respond to my environment. Whereas those that were authentic were actually quite dynamic. I told you some of the stories of how dynamic these individuals were. Balanced, quite unstable in terms of the structure. Those with limited authenticity were quite stable because they identify themselves around the organizational structures and career paths, right? So there's stability, but it's contingent. Whereas those other individuals are quite balanced and dynamic in their balance. And very traditional career perspective as opposed to a boundless career perspective. The senior people were saying, if I compare these young people to people in Burundi and Rwanda, they don't compare. And so my question then is this, in terms of the expectation that we then have on these young people, when they think so boundaryless, we expect them to come in and conform, but they think beyond the boundaries. And so how do we limit the progress and their attitudes and their perspectives of life when our experience have been so different? And hence the question I then ask, to what extent are we complicit in the oppression of these young people? And I'll talk about that in a moment, but let me not get ahead of myself. So the last one is, I enable people to achieve their full potential. So 5, 1, 2, or 3. Add up your scores. So add up all your scores. Then you take your score and you divide it by 15. Okay. So what percentage did you get? You got a percentage, right?
Right.
So that's a percentage. Did you all get a percentage? So when you divide it and then multiply by 100. So divide by 15, multiply by 100. So that's a percentage. Did you all figure that?
Yeah.
Everyone? Okay. Look, this is just what I use for my study. It's not, yeah, so don't get too, so okay, so if you scored below 50, you most likely are an inauthentic leader at work. If you scored between 51 and 75, you have limited authenticity. If you scored between above 76, you're likely to be an authentic leader, right? So what I want you to do now is think about your personal identity, your social identity, and you think about your role identity, your leadership role identity. How does your configuration look like? Remember those 3 configurations that I showed you earlier? Draw your configuration of who you are as a leader. What does that look like for you?
You have to remind me of
The other one. But the point is, draw it the way that you... It's up, because how we configure ourselves is so different to everyone else. The important thing to consider, think about your sense of uniqueness, my personal identity. Think about my social identity, and think about my leadership identity. And how do I put, where does leadership sit? Where does my personal identity sit? Where does my social identity sit? And how do I configure? Just think about the people and how the followers are experiencing you at the moment. Anyone care to share how they configured and what does that mean? Does it mean anything for them? Who's going to be vulnerable?
Well, I've got something. I just realized how fortunate I am because when I was quite young, I realized that I could not be fully myself, and I created an organization, my own organization, and how fortunate I am to be able to score very highly in this because I am so fully able, and then how that also mirrors into the people that I work with, and it really is a gift.
Thanks for sharing. Anyone else? One more person? Just, even if it doesn't make sense, then that's also okay to share.
So the thing with me was as you were going through it, was that I have had phases in my career where I've been completely authentic, and when I've reflected on it as you're talking, it often depended on the organization I was in, the leadership, the culture, the whatever. And what I was talking about was a reflection of where I find myself today. So I guess the authenticity can shift. So I was capable of being authentic, but I am currently not. And when you ask me to draw the 3 circles, I draw the personal and the social authenticity pretty much overlapping. And the leadership role, I kind of saw as a little bit out. And that had to do not with what I do with my own people, but with what I'm allowed, in inverted commas, to do as a member of the executive of the organization, where the culture or the norms and values, whatever you want to call them, I'm feeling restricted by, and I'm afraid to do it.
Very important point. This is not a constant.
Yeah.
This is, depending on what's happening in your environment, you will adjust where you're at.
Yeah.
But it's the self-awareness to know where you're at, to say, what do I need to do to create different balance or configuration between the elements that make up who I am, right?
And approximate authenticity, because I know that I can't do it fully at the moment.
And there's no right and wrong with this, right? There is no right and wrong. It's about the self-awareness, the consciousness. Because what happens is autopilot, right? We go through life autopilot. We don't think about who we are and how we show up. And so this is really helping you to create some consciousness about who you are and how you show up. One more point that we need to move on.
Well, maybe you can just put me together because I think I'm just scared. But then as the gentleman they was talking, I just actually looked at the leadership and then clubbed it with work. It's very funny because when I'm at work, I'm there, I'm 100%. I know that I would actually say I'm really, or I try to be authentic. And but then when now I'm pretty, let's say now my personal life, my home life, but that's when everything shifts for me. It's for me it's guided by many things, and also tradition, culture, all of the things. Being a wife, now there are many things now that I'm taking away from that leadership role that I have at work. For me, though, I'm not talking about anyone else. Because there are things now that I just have to work around. You know, all that. So there is a shift. And,
So all this is really about consciousness, right? So you need to think, what work do I need to do to create that kind of balance that I require in my life? So that I feel good about myself, I'm flexible, I'm agile, I'm balanced, and I'm boundless in the way I'm thinking about it. That's really, and it provides you a structure of thinking about it. But here's the point about oppression that I make. So this is how you can think about it. So regard, what I found in the study, that those with inauthentic had a stigmatized regard, as opposed to a positive. Those that were, their agility, inauthentic individuals were very inflexible. So it's about how do I create more flexibility to respond to my environment. Whereas those that were authentic were actually quite dynamic. You know, I told you some of the stories of how dynamic these individuals were. Balanced, quite unstable in terms of the structure. Those with limited authenticity were quite stable because they identify themselves around the organizational structures and career paths, right? So there's stability, but it's contingent. Whereas those other individuals are quite balanced and dynamic in their balance and very traditional career perspective as opposed to a boundless career perspective. I thought I'd share this because you could see then the continuum in terms of what's called facade of conformity. But what the research shows us as well, that facade of conformity actually affects our psychological well-being because it's a pretense. So yes, we can make, I mean, you've all worked in organizations. We sit in these long meetings and like, yeah, we're going to do it. They walk out and no one does it. Yeah. So that's the facade of, if our values are saying collaboration, we pretend to collaborate or we don't. But what the research shows us is that that facade of conformity has a psychological effect on individuals and teams and organizations over a long time. And it's just the awareness of what that does to us, right? And so there is, and I can share some of that with you if you're more curious about it.
Can we do one more?
Yeah.
Okay, just one more.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So here's another question I'd ask. How can you deal with a supervisor who feels threatened by your social identity at work?
So social identity, social identity could be your racial ethnic identity, so being black, being colored, being a woman, being gay. So there's all of those, right? And it, it's, I don't know, it's such a broad question because, I don't know how to answer that question, I'm sorry. Because it depends on the person, it depends on what the reasons are for their stigma, it depends on, there's so many dependencies. It depends on where the person comes from, their upbringing. So who are they as individuals? And so the same question I ask about yourselves as you think about how do you treat people that you work with? And do people, like this question, do your followers and subordinates ask the same question about you? And are you then complicit in the oppression of the people in your organization? I mean, that's really the question. So I'm happy to deal with that in an individual basis to get more context, but it's hard to answer without understanding the context truly. I want to wrap up, right? So, in summary, authentically, you can become an authentic leader when you support your followers to transcend the social stigma. I really appreciate it. I hope you find it useful. I wanted to say that the opportunity could be nowhere, but the opportunity for you to become an authentic leader could be now here. So here's my details. I've got cards on the table if you want to get some cards, if you want to have more conversations with me about this topic. You can see my passion around it. I can talk for hours about it. I want to just thank you for joining me today.